A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Karl Faase is our guest. He's the CEO of Olive Tree Media. You'll know him from a whole bunch of great video series. Karl loves to tell the stories, and we're talking about not just stories for the sake of entertainment, but entertaining stories that really do matter. Karl, let's talk about, let's move our attention maybe to, say, sport. You know, we've just come out of the Olympic Games, like our most successful Olympic Games ever. We did well in so many different areas, because some will say our national religion is sport. How do you reflect, and what sort of stories have you come across over these years around our sporting heritage?
Yeah, well, there's some great stories of people of faith that were great sportsmen. In fact, just using your phrase, that the episode on Faith Runs Deep on sport is actually called That Other Religion. And it's passionate in Australia. But did you know that Australia's first ever sporting world champion? And that was in 1876. It was on the Thames in London, and a guy called Ned Trickett, who was actually the son of a convict who was sponsored by James Punch, who owned the pub in Sydney, to race for the World Championship in single sculls, and he won on the 27th of June, 1876. Now, the interesting thing about that story, I'm going to come tell you a bit more about Ned Trickett in a moment, but the interesting thing about that story is Ned Trickett is my wife's great-grandfather. So there's a family story in all of this. He came back to Australia, Neil. He was a rock star. I mean, you think of any well-known sportsman in Australia and he would have shaded him. He had his face on all pictures on all lampposts. 30,000 people met him at Circular Quay in Sydney when he arrived back. He defended his world championship on the Parramatta River in New South Wales. But to shorten this story, he ended up going to after he finished racing, he ended up going to Rockhampton. In Rockhampton, he ran a pub. The pub went broke. He came back to Sydney, and this is really shortening a long story. He comes back to Sydney, and Ned has got 9 kids. He's a past superstar, world champion, rock star in the colony. He's got no income. There's a depression on. Therefore, none of his friends who looked after him have much money. And he's desperate, and he's actually depressed. In fact, there were those who said he looked like he was going to take his own life. And he's walking around the centre of Sydney, and he sees a little crowd on the corner in the centre of Sydney, and he goes over to the crowd, and there it is E.P. Field, and E.P. Field was a barrister, and E.P. Field was also part of a group called Open Air Campaigners, and he was telling people about Jesus on a street corner. And Ned Trickett listened a couple of times, came back, went back to E.P. Field's rooms, and E.P. Field knew who he was. And E.P. Field led Australia's first ever sporting world champion to a relationship with Jesus. And he joined the Salvation Army, and he followed Jesus for the rest of his life. And it's just the most remarkable story.
And who would have thought that there were Christians, church connections, to our winning world championships in the history of Australia? And what a wonderful connection that is. And it's actually astounding because, you know, when you talk about your own family connection there on your wife's side and being connected to him, it's interesting, isn't it, when you talk about the power of story, how these stories, they get passed down from generation to generation, and they're contributing to the faith that we have today. So lots of people will be able to reflect on their own family heritage. Some can trace their way all the way back to maybe the First Fleet. But the Christian elements on that, they do get passed down. Sometimes there's some family members who go astray, but lots of family members take notice of those, and that's a strengthening for their faith, isn't it? Any reflection on that?
Totally. And one of the things that Stuart Piggin used when we interviewed Stuart Piggin, one of the points he made was in Australia, the great dynasties of faith. And that's so important. So that when someone comes to faith, like Ned Trickett did, it's not a solo event and it's just him. There are dynasties of faith that are built out of that relationship with Jesus. And one of the things that we do is share our own stories on Faith Runs Deep. And I chatted about my dad's story. So when people ask me about how did you become a Christian, Karl, I often say, let me tell you about my dad. My dad was an immigrant, came from Germany. He came by himself. His sister was already here. He promised his sister he would follow her. He was in his mid-20s. He had no faith background at all. He then went to Tambar Springs. We're talking about Muta and Burra, and now we're at Tambar Springs. Near Tambar Springs is about 100 kilometres south, probably slightly east of Gunnedah. This is northwest New South Wales. He went there to help on a farm, sponsored out from Germany. When he's there, I was born there, my brother was born there, my sister as well, and he's on a farm. And then the local preacher, Darryl, I've forgotten his name now, but Darryl decided that he wanted to have a mission. So Darryl Robinson invited two city slicker preachers, John Chapman and John Turner, and they turned up, and everybody in town, including my dad, turned up to listen to these city slicker preachers. And at the end of this one night, my dad talked to John Turner. John Turner led him in a prayer, and he wrote down a little, memoir he wrote himself, that everything was different. Everything was different. And that changed our family's life and our family's trajectory. It changed my life to move into the ministry I'm in. It changed our kids' lives, my children, their children, and there's please God, it would be a dynasty of faith. But Neil, that is just a fabulous, fabulous story of faith where somebody in this tiny little church in the back blocks of nowhere, everybody would say, has made a huge, I think, made a deep impact on my dad and therefore changed our family. And that's part of our story.
Wonderful insight and so much value on the choices we make because those choices are going to affect the generations to come when those stories are passed down. Hey, lovely talking about your visits into the Outback. I know you love the Outback and you're about to go to an old stamping ground of mine, one of my old hometowns. Longreach is due for an unearthed event. When's that coming up?
14th of October, and if you're from Longreach or anywhere near it, you should be there. Just to let people know how these events work, Neil. The local churches all work together. We basically partner with local churches. It's not just us turning up to run an event. And so the key churches in Longreach are going to be involved, and they'll invite people from the community. It's a pretty simple event. We have Colin Buchanan, the country music star, come, and he does. He always throws in a couple of his kid songs, but it's him as a country music artist, and he does. And then we have somebody who will tell their story. And in Longreach, we'll have Tim Kelly. Now Tim Kelly's story is on Faith Runs Deep, and I'll just chat to him. We'll do an interview, and he'll tell his story.
Stop for us. We stopped for the news, but we're back to talking about Tim Kelly, the world champion bull rider. Give us your insights here into his amazing story.
Well, the amazing thing, Neil, was when we started this, a friend of mine who lives in a regional area, and he heard about us producing Faith Runs Deep, and he said, can I help at all? And I said, Duncan, do you know a bull rider? He said, yeah, Tim Kelly's your man. And Tim lives at Kingaroy. We went to Kingaroy and interviewed him on his farm where he runs a bull riding school, actually. So, Neil, if radio gets a bit tiresome for you and bull riding looks like an option, Tim Kelly's your man for learning how to ride bulls. But Tim grew up riding bulls just basically as a young kid. And he ended up going, because there's bull riding and there's saddle bronc riding. Now, he went to the Calgary Stampede as a young man back in the 70s and actually won the World Saddle Bronc Championship at the Calgary Stampede. I mean, it's just massive. And he came back to Australia and he rode all the rodeos in Western Queensland and New South Wales. And it's actually quite well known. I mean, people turn up when we have Tim Kelly. People turn up to listen to Tim Kelly because he's well known in those circles. And but Tim was very successful and went to there was $1 million rodeo that was being held between Sydney and Melbourne, and all these riders came out from America because of the amount of money that was available. This was in the 80s. And Tim, I said, Tim, what were you like then? He said, well, I'd ride during the day and then pick as much as I could at night and then get up the next day and be riding again. That was his whole life. And yet it just was pretty hollow. And he saw with this rodeo on that these American guys weren't going to the pub getting smashed with everybody else. They were going to a hall. and they were going to a meeting. And he's like, I don't know what those guys have got, but I'm going to find out what those guys have got. And he turned up at the hall. There was a biker telling his story, and Tim thought, if God can help that guy, God can help me. And he gave his life to Jesus, and then from then on became someone who would share his faith in the rodeo circuit, and continues to do that. And when Tim's fans turn up, Neil, they all have big hats and big belt buckles. We've got a story of a young guy who heard that Tim was coming to one of our gatherings and for one of our One Earth events. He just started going out with a girl who was part of a church in northern New South Wales. And he said to his girlfriend, do you mind if I go to this? And because the girlfriend's parents, good Baptist family, were a bit unsure about this, their daughter going out with this guy, and this young guy who wasn't a Christian. He turned up and listened to Tim Kelly and he came because he saw the flyer. Tim Kelly's name was on the flyer, and he said, can I go to this? They all turn up. He gives his life to Jesus, and he's met with the pastor since. It's just a fabulous story. So we're seeing stories of faith. As we unearth stories like Tim Kelly's, we actually find people who want to take steps of faith.
I've just discovered that his wild ways earned him the reputation with the nickname, the Aussie drinking machine. So there's a certain sense, isn't there, in which, there's some things that do characterise our outback, and people do relate to that. And so when there's a transformation story like that, people do want to catch a hold of it. They want to, at least before they decide to change their own ways, actually find out what it's done for someone else. So this is, again, the power of story, isn't it? So you have someone who tells their story, and then others go, well, you know what, I'm discovering that, the sort of life I'm living is empty too, and here's a different direction to go. Is that just, let me take you just theologically here for a moment. Is this a part of the gospel presentation, that you can just tell the stories of people like this because it is a part of the testimony we have as believers?
Yeah, because one of the things I talk about when I speak at these unearthed events is that the Christian faith is transformational. Because often what people think about is that it's like good advice how to live a better life. And Tim Kelly's living a much better life than he was a drinking machine. But the point is that it's not about good advice, it's good news. And the good news is the person of Jesus, and that's what makes a difference. It's not because people come up to an event like that and hear Tim Kelly's story and hear stories like and stories with and think, oh, that's a better option. That, hey, I'll tell out that story. Something else happens. And what happens is Jesus comes and changes people's lives. It's not about go home, try hard, and be better, be nicer. That's going to make you a better person. No, Jesus comes in, transforms people's lives, and transforms them from the inside out. So faith is a transformation by the power of God.
Karl, a little bit fuzzy around the edges with your phone there. Just check where you're holding that for a moment, in case that's something to do with the way the phone is, or where you are in the room, or how that might be. But I know that there'll be a lot of people looking forward to hearing you tell the story of Tim Kelly, and you're about to visit Longreach in Queensland. I think you said the 14th of October, and no doubt there'll be listeners to our conversation right now saying, where am I going to be able to hear this? So is there a particular venue you've already got planned when you visit Longreach?
That material is coming together, and if you go let you know exactly where that is. Like right now, I can't tell you where the venue is, but that's all coming together, and it'll be ready for Longreach.
Okay, that's all coming together. Hey, we've got a little issue with this audio. I'm going to try and see if we can take a few moments to see if we can fix that. And so just bear with us. Some more great stories still to come. Hey, Karl, let's move on. There's plenty of stories to tell. We don't want to miss talking about maybe, the people who have been helping to shape the values of our nation. The things like our politicians and early governors and such things. These are the sorts of stories you're interested in too.
Yeah, because one of those that helped enormously in shaping who we are is one of our earlier governors, Lachlan Macquarie in New South Wales. And Lachlan Macquarie came out with his wife Elizabeth, and I'll really shorten this story up quite a bit. But he was a Christian guy. He and his wife Elizabeth were reading the Bible together and asking, what is it to be a Christian governor? Now it's tricky to ask what is it to be a Christian politician, but when you're the governor of a penal colony, what does that mean? And one of the things that became really important to him was, if God gave me a second chance, if God gave me this idea of forgiveness for my past, shouldn't I extend that to other people? So Governor Bligh, the governor before Lachlan Macquarie, emancipated, it's a long word which basically means gave freedom to, but he gave freedom to or emancipated 2 convicts. Lachlan Macquarie emancipated 1,550 convicts. Now, it was all about this notion of a fresh start, of a new opportunity. Now, the intriguing thing is, I said right back in the beginning, for people being with us all the way through this conversation, Neil, I said right back in the beginning that people saw the convicts as not those who had committed a crime, but those who had criminal character. And so there was this notion that you couldn't actually be redeemed, and that was almost a part of the philosophical thinking of why they sent them so far from England, because they were irredeemable people. Lachlan Macquarie said, no, nobody's irredeemable. God redeemed me, and God can redeem other people. Now, I think, Lachlan Macquarie is not a perfect story. There's a bunch of things about Lachlan Macquarie as a young man, and then some couple of decisions when he was governor. So no one's pretending that these people are perfect, but he recognised that God gave him a second chance, and he wanted to do that for other people. And therefore, I think set in our culture, that notion about giving everybody a second chance, kind of this notion that we do believe that you do get a second chance in life. That's part of our culture as our nation. And I think you can look back to Lachlan Macquarie and say, that could be part of that. Even after Lachlan Macquarie, if you go a few more years, Neil, everyone listen to us. If you especially drive around country New South Wales, places in Victoria, places in Queensland, you'll know that you drive into towns, and people listening, think about this. You'll often drive in a country town and you'll see 4 churches. They're about the same size, and they look like they're about the same age, and they look pretty similar. So why would we have all those churches? And one of the things that Stuart Piggin discovered and told us about is a thing called the 1836 Church Act. Now, a governor after Lachlan Macquarie, a few years after Lachlan Macquarie, was a guy called Richard Burke. He was a high church Anglican, but Richard Burke actually believed that if you're going to build a good community and a good society, you need religion to be a part of that. And if you're going to have religion and faith being a part of that, you're going to have to help that be created. Richard Burke and others also didn't like the fact that England was so sectarian. There was a big divide between the Catholics and the Anglicans, and the Anglicans, the Church of England, connected to the government, and he was most unhappy about that. But he wanted to see faith be given an opportunity in a new emerging culture like Australia. So he started the 1836 Church Act. And you know what that was, Neil? That if you were in a community somewhere and you were a gathering of Anglicans, Catholics, Wesleyans or Methodists or Presbyterians, the government would build your church for you. And literally, probably thousands of churches were built over a generation because of the 1836 Church Act. And why do we have that amazing asset across Australia of all of those church buildings? It was down to someone who said, faith and religion is important to make this nation a great nation.
So the government working with churches to build social cohesion and harmony in communities with, as you say, that need for religion, which is good for society. Yep. Some of us might be praying that those sorts of times will return again, because right now, and I'll just get a little comment from you here, because right now it seems to be that churches are being ignored and avoided when it comes to the social cohesion and the flourishing of our society. And there does seem to be, and you don't have to look too deep to see that things not going so well in so many areas. Do you think there's some sort of need for those stories to be told in such a way that it might even promote the same sort of government and church connections?
Oh, look, I don't think we're going to get the government paying for the building of our churches again. But the problem is, if you go back to the pre-1950s, Christian faith was quite central to who we were as a nation. Then the 60s and 70s, sexual revolution, Vietnam War, social revolution, there was this whole sense of, church now, well, that's the past era. If you want to be a person of faith, you want to be a Christian, knock yourself out. But you're now a bit irrelevant to the society in which we live. Neil, it changed again in the early 2000s, and it changed from being irrelevant to being dangerous. Now, this often came out of people like Richard Dawkins, who said that his attitude of hands-off religion in the church went down with the 9/11 towers. So the World Trade Center towers had collapsed after the attack on them in 9/11. Now, people listening to us will say, well, that wasn't Christians, but the notion was this is what religion does. So religion, Christianity inferred, became a dangerous idea. And so what do you do with dangerous ideas? Well, you pull it out of the public square. So you pull a dangerous idea out of media, out of schools, out of universities. And in some ways, that's been the result and the response of a lot of people a lot of people in political leadership. Now, partly there's a kind of ideology behind that as well, because there are certain political parties with an ideology that's quite anti-faith and anti-religion, and therefore anything we can do to stamp that out, we will do that. And there's been some pretty noted examples of politicians that have done that. I think we're in a time of change, Neil, but I think what we need to do is push back to remind people exactly what going back to the beginning of what I said, exactly what Roy Williams was talking about. This country was built on Christian capital. And Neil, this is a split, this little piece that I'm saying now is a split between watching Jesus the Game Changer, how the life and teaching of Jesus changed the world and why it matters, and Faith Runs Deep, the stories of faith within this country. Both those are important. The ideological foundations of Australia, which is a country built on Christian values. Tom Holland does a whole bunch of that in his book Dominion. And then the stories of faith that have helped make this nation what it is, they are both important and both are very significant at this time. And I think any politician that feels that standing against the church is the way to build a country is missing both of those pieces of that puzzle.
Words of wisdom. Let's squeeze in a call here. Tim in Redbank Creek in Queensland. Hey, Tim, welcome along.
G'day, Karl. I was just thinking about you driving around in that V8 Ute. Is it one of the last ones ever made, was it?
Here's a man who knows his utes. Yes. It's not quite the last. Ours is a 2013 VF SSV, and then the last one was, I think, 2016. But Tim, it's very close to the end of the runs, which is a great tragedy for manufacturing in our country.
I think that's what I was touching on. Like, you're driving a piece of Australian history. I bet it sparks a lot of conversation, and it just embodies the result of godly governance in since Federation. We had a car industry. I think we had four manufacturers at one stage. We had Mitsubishi, Toyota, Holden, and Ford, and now we've got nothing. And the politicians and the like would have you believe that every decision they make going forward is a smart one, regardless of what sector you're talking about. You sit back as an observer and look at where we've come. I mean, I've got one of the last Australian-made fridges. I've got a Westinghouse fridge. They don't make fridges anymore. It's got an Australian-made sticker on it. And we can't buy an Australian-made car. Luckily, we still make Kenworth trucks and Volvo trucks in Australia. But how long? The way energy prices are going. I mean, it just shows that, sadly now, that the country, we're reaping the rewards of the people that we put in place to govern our country. I just thought I'd leave you with those. Tim,
you're making some good points there, and that's interesting too, because it is a political insight that you're making here, Tim. The people who are shaping our culture and their attitudes to faith. And I guess, if we're reflecting on the 200 plus years since colonisation and the development of government and all of that time, Karl, some might be thinking, this might be a partisan thing, but I guess there's been some strengths and some failures on both sides. But there's always been this sort of connection to faith, even on conservative and progressive politics.
Yeah, I really appreciate Tim's comment there. And interestingly, we wanted to have some comments on both sides of the political spectrum. And I wondered, given some of the stances of much of the Labor Party in Australia at the moment, will we find that? And what I realised that I was demonstrating my ignorance, Neil. So if you go back to the late 19th century, what you actually find is that the Labor Party and the unions were actually driven by and dominated by Protestant Christianity, and not just Catholics, the Catholic Christianity out of Ireland, which there was a lot of that in the Labor movement in the mid 20th century. And the interesting thing is that one of the people I discovered was a guy called W.G. Spence. Now, you might not have might not know the name W.G. Spence. W.G. Spence came from the Wimmera district of Victoria. He started the Shearers Union. He started the Miners Union. He was key in the starting of the AWU. W.G. Spence was a Presbyterian. He was a Bible-believing, Sabbath-observing, teetotaling Presbyterian. And W.G. Spence wasn't on his own in that space. In fact, one of the things that Roy Williams said to us, let me give you three names from the Labor movement in Australia. One, W.G. Spence, who I've just talked about. Second, Andrew Fisher, who was the Prime Minister of Australia on three separate occasions around the world wars. And James McGowan, the first Labor Party Premier of New South Wales. And Roy Williams said, what did those three men have in common? That before they went into politics, they were the head of the Sunday school in each of their churches.
Wow.
So what you have, and even in 1891, I think it was 1891, Steve Shavora was telling me that there were, 35 Labor members voted into the New South Wales Party, the New South Wales Parliament. 21 of those were Protestants. And the Catholic paper writing about these Protestant politicians who were Labor Party members talked about the Labor Party being full of Bible punchers and pulpit thumpers. That was the last time you heard the Labor Party described as Bible punchers and pulpit thumpers. I mean, that whole movement was deeply influenced by Protestant Christianity.
Well, times do change, and some might have that as their prayer for a Labor Party of the future. I want to say thank you to Tim in Redbank Creek. Appreciate your call. Time has run out. You're off to Longreach. Just mentioning that you've been to Launceston in Tassie. You've been and done one of your unearthed events in Toowoomba. You've been into Rockhampton in Queensland during Beef Week in Rockhampton. You've teamed up with Colin Buchanan. You mentioned he sings a few kids' songs as well, but does some great, I guess you'd call that the worship entertainment part of your gatherings. You've got a gathering coming up in Longreach on the 14th of October. So how do people connect with the latest things that you're doing, Karl? Where's the best place for people to follow along with what you're doing? Maybe to subscribe, to follow you on social media? How do people follow you around and be a part of what good things you're doing?
So olivetreemedia.com.au, olivetreemedia.com.au. All the details are there. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter. You can actually sign up for the Daily Nudge. The Daily Nudge is on Vision Media as lots of other Christian stations, but we also release that as a daily email. So if you'd like to get a daily email from us, like a devotion to start your day, all free, no cost at all, just go to our website and you can sign up for the newsletter, which will keep you up to date. It's just a monthly prayer letter, the Daily Nudge, so you can get a daily devotion between Monday to Friday, and then you can look at all the material that we do. We've got a lot going on, and it's really exciting, and we're looking forward to both, because we're getting into next year, Neil. We're right now, we're going to Wagga in February, we're going to Gunnedah after Easter, we're talking to Dubbo at the moment, so there'll be a whole bunch of the unearthed events in 2025 as well.
And for all these great stories that you're able to tell, some of those, no doubt, are part of these earlier series that you've done, Faith Runs Deep and the Jesus the Game Changer. And for people who are wanting to connect with those, of course, olivetreemedia.com.au, and they make good church and small group series to go through as well. Karl Faase is the CEO of Olive Tree Media. Karl, always good catching up. Let's do another little update sometime soon on how you're going with that ute of yours and getting around the place and the unearthed events. But appreciate you very much, and thank you so much for taking some time to share your heart with us today on 2020.
Neil, always good to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.